Hi guys, welcome back to the One Take Show, a podcast where we celebrate incredible conversation with some phenomenal people. And this is the 50th episode of the One Take Show, which means that I have spoken to 50 different people over a period of 3 months. And I don't know if you realize this or not, but conversations can change life. After speaking to 50 different people, leaders and luminaries in their own respective fields, especially from legal field, I have spoken to some of the stalwarts, and I have realized that I have so much to learn, and I have also learned so much already. I have assimilated so much information, so much perspective, so many conversations have added value to my life and have given me so many possibilities to exploit, and I truly believe and hope that these conversations through this platform will benefit as many students, as many law students as it can. It can add value to anyone who tunes into these podcasts and listens to these episodes. In this episode, the 50th episode of the One Take Show, I bring to you a conversation that is absolutely mind-blowing. I am in conversation with a very special guest. Our guest is Ms. Vyjayanti Vasanta Mogli. Ma'am is a transgender rights activist. Being a transgender person herself, she brings to us the first-hand account of all the atrocities, all the discrimination that happens in our society, all the evils that plague our society today. In this episode, she talks about her journey, she talks about the activism, we'll talk about everything, sex, gender, transsexual persons, transgender persons. We'll talk about the various legislations that she has managed to somehow modify in benefit of the transgender persons, how she has been part of some of the most groundbreaking litigations. We will also talk about how this pandemic is affecting the transgender persons in the worst possible manner. If you like this conversation, make sure you like, share and subscribe to the channel. If you like the podcast, make sure you do subscribe to the channel, because a lot of viewers do not necessarily subscribe to the channel. It just shows that you support the episodes, you support the podcast, and somehow do want to return to the channel again and again. It's a very good validation for me. But to be very honest, if you want any particular episode to be featured, if you have any suggestions or feedbacks, make sure you write them down in the comment section. You can always reach out to me and let me know what else can be improved in the podcast. This is a movement that has been created for the students by a law student, and I truly believe that we all can benefit from this process. Hence, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let's commence the 50th episode of the One Take Show. Coming right in. Hello ma'am, welcome to the One Take Show. This is a very important opportunity for every listener of the One Take Show to learn about issues and topics which are plaguing the society in general. And who better to learn this from but someone who has experienced them, who has fought them as an advocate, as an activist, who has raised these issues. Thank you so much for taking time off your really busy schedule and sitting down with me for this amazing conversation.
Thank you, Kaustubh. I'm glad we are talking.
Thank you, ma'am. Before we begin, my first question to you off the bat would be that what inspired you to stand up for the rights of LGBTIQ community? What inspired you to advocate the issues that are plaguing the society in general? And how has your journey been thus far?
Well, I am a transgender woman myself. I'm a transgender person. So I've had to fight some of my own battles. And my battles are not very different from the rest of those in the transgender communities, or perhaps to an extent similar to the other members of the LGBTIQ communities. And when there are so many similarities, I wouldn't say they're identical, but they're similar at some levels, if not at all. And collectivization brings in a certain strength. Most movements, be it the freedom struggle of India or the abolition of the Devadasi system or the anti-caste movement, most movements were collectivized. They weren't fought by any one or two people.
Right.
So it was just that, to collectivize.
Right. And for the benefit of our viewers, when we talk about a transgender person, if I ask you a very naive question for the basic clarification of a person, in the socio-political sense, what and who is a transgender person? And there is often a confusion with intersex
Mm,
persons and the
mm,
constitutional rights so awarded. What is a
mm.
transgender person, and how should we perceive this section of the society with respect to social political situations?
Okay. Even before we go there, gender
Mhm.
and biological sex are almost often conflated, and these are not the same. They're two separate things. Biological sex has the attributes um, with which a person could be born genetically, anatomically, physiologically, and so on, hormonally, and so on. While
Right.
gender is how a person envisions himself or herself for themselves, and
Mhm.
how that person or a group of persons would like the society to identify them.
Mhm.
Now, with this as an axiom, um, we can deconstruct some myths that neither gender nor biological sex are binary.
Right.
Binary, as you know, is just two options, male, female, and neither of these are binary. Now, parking transgender persons for a short while, even within biological sex is itself not binary, because a baby could be born with possibility one, no genitalia, possibility two, both genitalia, possibility three, fully formed genitalia of one sex, and partly formed or not fully formed genitalia of the other sex. Possibility for the child appears to be male and nobody or female, nobody suspects any difference. But
Mhm.
the child may never attain puberty, um, may never get adolescent, or despite attaining the age of adolescence, no secondary sexual characteristics. Possibility five, all of these happen. But at some stage, when that child grows up to be an adult, wishes to procreate, they're unable to procreate. Possibility five. But these are just five possibilities. There are many, many, many more such
Mhm.
possibilities. Not because I'm not a biologist, I'm just sharing things that I know, and there's so much that I don't know because biology is not my subject. And
Right.
we, again, mind you, we're just talking about biological sex, which itself is so diverse.
Mhm.
Now, if we were to come back to gender and who transgender persons are,
Right.
transgender persons could be intersex, that is, they could be born into bodies that are neither genetically, anatomically male nor female,
Mhm.
or may not be intersex. Not
Okay.
all transgender persons are intersex,
Mhm.
and not all intersex persons identify as transgender persons.
Okay.
Somebody who looks as masculine as, say, anybody else, if they were to be told at 25 or 26 that they're actually intersex, I'm not sure if they would embrace the intersex and transgender identity, having been socialized for 24, 25, 30, 40 years into a cisgender, heterosexual social identity. So, as I said, not all intersex people identify as transgender, and not all transgender people are intersex. So, who are these non intersex transgender persons? And what makes us transgender? What is it by virtue of which we identify as transgender? It's just not this one reason that I'm about to reveal, but this is one of the overwhelming reasons. There are many other reasons and causes. A condition called, by virtue of which the body is
Mhm.
constantly rejected by the mind, and that condition, which was earlier pathologized as gender identity disorder, and since a few years and decades, the World Health Organization has depathologized it. Pathology is the study of diseases and disorders. Earlier,
Mhm.
it was called gender identity disorder, and now it's no longer gender identity disorder. Both the World Health Organization, its ICD, International Classification of Diseases 11, as well as the Americans who follow the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, both of them have
Right.
depathologized. It's no
Mhm.
longer a disorder. It's just a difference. Like how, for instance, you are perhaps 4 or 5 or 6 tones fairer than I, and it doesn't make sense for anybody to tell me, how dare you be so dark? Look at Kaustubh, he's so fair. You should be ashamed of yourself for being 5 or 6 shades darker than Kaustubh. It doesn't make sense because Kaustubh
Oh,
didn't earn his complexion, yeah? Nor did
true.
I earn my complexion.
Mhm.
So, in all of this, we must remember that biological sex and gender, while they both are different, are always assigned at birth. They're assigned at birth when children are born, because the child doesn't know if he,
Mm-hmm.
she, they are male or female. They're told, oh, you're male because your body is this, because your genitalia is this, because blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
And it isn't a problem if that child aligns and identifies as well with that assigned gender. But
Right.
it becomes a huge problem if that child does not align with that assigned gender and
Right.
sex.
Mm-hmm.
So such people who needn't be intersex, who could be intersex, who may not be intersex, but don't align and have a certain dysphoria with their assigned gender, could identify as transgender persons.
Right, ma'am. And to that extent, my question to you would be that with all of this issue that surrounds the so-called identity, we understand that this gender identity disorder, which was previous up till very recently was perceived as a disease, is now been apologized for. We see that this sort of normal people might also be transgenders, although I am not really sure what it means. But we also talk about that transgender people do not necessarily need to be intersex people. So all of this conversation, which perhaps is not being talked about much, might be a breeding ground for, let's say, discrimination. What is your opinion on the said causes of discrimination, and what are the major discriminations that are being faced by transgender community in general?
Um, Now, even before I answer that, let's go back to ask ourselves, where do we see transgender persons? In our day to day lives, where do we see them, or wherever? Uh, we may not see them every day, but if at all we see them, where do we often get to see transgender person? And somewhere in that answer lies the answer to a great extent to the question you posed. We see transgender persons most of the time at railway stations, in trains, traffic signals, on the roads, at busy marketplaces, and perhaps also at night, all dolled up in makeup and doing sex work. During the day, they beg, they seek alms, and uh, we also see them sometimes, though not on a daily basis. We also see them sometimes, see transgender persons sometimes at birthday parties, at cradle ceremonies, naming ceremonies of newborn infants, at weddings, at engagement ceremonies, auspicious and festive occasions, and so on, where they come to bless and seek alms. But such auspicious and festive occasions do not happen on a daily basis. So, on a more regular basis, the sources of livelihood, the two predominant sources of livelihood, are undeniably begging and sex work.
Right.
And if bulk of the transgender community is dependent on begging and sex work, and sometimes on seeking alms during auspicious and festive occasions,
Mm-hmm.
is I wonder if it is that invisible a problem to figure out where the discrimination is. Yeah, because it's glaring, staring, and flagrantly screaming at us. Let's compare the transgender communities and transgender persons with where the women's rights movement or women were 70, 80 years ago or 90 years ago before independence. Did we have as many women judges in the 1930s and 40s and even 50s and 60s and 70s? To the best of my understanding, the very first woman Supreme Court judge was Justice Fatima Bibi. And I suppose, I hope I'm not wrong, but I suppose the very first judge, CJ, was Justice Leela Seth, who passed away recently, who was part of the Justice Verma panel. And there were barely any women in law, there were barely any women CEOs, there were barely any women entrepreneurs. They were there, but they had to be people born into generational privilege, born to some super privileged business family, or born into a galaxy of lawyers and academicians and so on. And I don't know, ask any senior lawyer who's 80 years or 85, somebody like the Attorney General today, he's a very senior person. ask such senior a person if there were any women lawyers in courts in the 50s and 60s, and you know what the answer will be, what the
Right.
answer is. So
Right.
the transgender community too is, say, somewhere even behind that, because 70, 80 years ago, I don't think bulk of the women in the women's rights movement were on the roads begging or doing sex work. But that's the case today, yet, with transgender people, despite 6.25 years of the Nalsa judgment.
Mhm.
Uh, and so I guess we are caught between the binaries. And as transgender persons, as queer and transgender persons, we have often, very, very often, and almost always contested binaries, be they of gender, be they of opinion, be they of ideologies.
Right.
Uh,
Mhm.
so, uh, you see, bulk of our humanity, if you look at the Kinsey scale, bulk of our humanity is considered bisexual or pansexual. Although social conditioning conditions children to accept cisgender
System.
homosexuality, has more acceptance over any other form of gender and sexuality.
Mhm.
And so that bias of uh, building a hierarchy of which places heterosexuality, my apologies,
Mhm.
cisgender heterosexuality over and above all other forms of gender identities, gender expressions, and sexual orientations and sexualities is dictated by, say, patriarchy, dictated by classism, dictated by casteism, dictated by many other forms of social exclusions. So I think this answers the question enough as to why there is discrimination. Is there discrimination?
True, true. I think this paints a very clear picture for anyone who would, in any possible circumstances, try and attempt to argue against it. There is a blatant problem that is facing us in our society today. One such question that I would like to ask you here is that, which really brings me to a conversation where we as law students, very particularly law students, can actually relate to you, is that you've been a part of a lot of litigations that have attempted to solve these issues that the transgender communities are facing. I won't name those specific writ petitions or those specific PILs, but there have been certain demands, there have been certain requests for the courts to consider. And in the very recent one of them, which I was reading and I previously discussed with you as well, you've listed down certain requests with respect to the needs and the requirements of transgender persons, especially in times of crisis. So, how did you start with litigation as a process, and what exactly is the principle behind, and what have you been asking, requesting, and demanding from the courts or the institutions that certain reliefs be provided to the transgender persons?
Um, so I never started with litigation. It was never my first choice.
Right. Okay.
It was more. It began with engaging within communities, understanding my own life's journey, the structural violations and monstrosities and social exclusions that I've suffered, the discrimination I faced, and the discrimination, exclusion, and violence that pervades the transgender communities, pervades the queer LGBTIQ++ communities. Um, and then slowly, say about 10 years ago, I began filing RTIs under the Right to Information Act 2005. So
Right.
that I began gathering information. Now, what do you do with this information? So part of which is descriptive, part of which is statistical as well, because you get certain numbers and statistics. So there's a lot of scope to research and get insights out of such data.
Mhm.
Apart from getting insights and writing research, there's also a lot of scope to engage with governments, both central and state, to frame and for them to revisit their public policy and implementation of law, enforcement of law. Um, so at times we have, I wouldn't say that we've consistently succeeded or most of the time succeeded,
Mhm.
because my experience, and people can feel free to disagree, is that governments are not consistently or most of the time that open to feedback. I mean, is something that most governments say, but it's more of talk and very few governments walk the talk. So from time to time, when we get cornered, when repeated feedback, repeated representations over a period of time don't yield results, we escalate, we go one level above, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 levels above. And if even then, if it doesn't yield results, then what is the option than to litigate? Yeah. So litigation is never our first choice, because it's one, there are costs involved. Two, it's a long drawn process. And if things can get done without litigation, that's always a better option, through engagement, through consultations, and so on. But that hasn't, unfortunately, been the experience. So beginning my first PIL was on the UNUX Act, Telangana UNUX Act 1919 of 1919, which is Telangana UNUX Act 1329F, which was a archaic British law enacted 100 years ago in 1919 that used the word eunuch, which is a very dehumanizing term. All that it means is a castrated male body, and it gives sweeping powers to the police to arrest any quote-unquote eunuch without a warrant, and to display the names, addresses, and details of all eunuchs in the jurisdiction of a police station on the notice board, with their details, and allows the police to mandate that such, I don't like the word eunuch, so I will say quote-unquote, allow such listed quote-unquote people listed as quote-unquote eunuchs to present themselves every week to the police station as though they're criminals out on bail. So this was a very archaic, monstrous law that yet remained in the statute books. Although monstrous laws like these, like the Criminal Tribes Act, were denotified long ago. And this wasn't denotified. So I challenged its constitutionality. We held consultations. We gave representations. Nothing came out of it. We waited for about 9 months or 1 year. Nothing much came out of it. It wasn't abrogated or repudiated by the legislature or the government. So then we went to court. That was the first PIL. The second one was on the non-implementation of NALSA judgment, which NALSA judgment, as you know, was delivered in April 2014. And Navtej was delivered in September 2018, 4.25 years later, 4.5 years later. And in Telangana and many other states, and even till date, out of the 29 or 30 states, I think the 29 states and 7 or 9 union territories, I'm not sure. So out of those, only about 7 states have begun some work. The rest of the 22 states are non-starters, and many of the union territories are non-starters on the implementation of the NALSA judgment. So we had to move a PIL in the Telangana High Court because it's easier for me to deal with one state where I live. And the court issued interim orders that the government frame a policy. Very recently, during COVID as well, many transgender persons have been severely affected because their traditional transgender livelihoods, like begging and sex work, are out of question now in the age of physical distancing. I don't like the word social distancing because it can sound very stigmatizing and it may end up reinforcing stigma. So in this age of physical distancing, many transgender persons are unable to make ends meet. So they need relief through Prime Minister Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana, through many other schemes, through the civil supplies departments of the respective states for them to get rations and dry supplies of food through the public distribution system. What we also noticed was that the police force was distributing rations. Now, it's always welcome, but it's really not the job of the police to distribute rations. And it's always done as a one-off or a two-off or a three-off gesture of goodwill. The police can never, they cannot take up on themselves the monthly public distribution system. You get what I mean? It can never be a substitute. So when we filed the PIL, the government said that the police have distributed the ration. Now that cannot substitute. Over and above the public distribution system, it's absolutely okay for the police or NGOs or capitalists or anybody to distribute ration as a gesture of goodwill, which will be 1, 2, 3, 10 or 50 or 100 times gestures of goodwill. But they cannot be demanded as a right. Not a citizen can go to his or her or their respective police station and demand rations from the SHO. Can they? They can't, right? So the PDS had to be extended to transgender persons, and we have sworn affidavits in the High Court where the state of Telangana, where state governments have said that bulk of the transgender communities are not covered in the public distribution system. So despite a Food Security Act which guarantees food security, bulk of the transgender community is not even covered. To give you the numbers, in the first sworn affidavit, the government said that we've covered 2,175 transgender people, we've covered many transgender people, and so on. If you go back to 2011 census, when the state of Telangana was informed, it was a unified state of Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. The unified state itself had 43,000 transgender persons, assuming that half of them came to Telangana, which is 21,500. Or 1/3 or 1/4, which could range from 15,000 to 20 to 21,500. Assuming that it was 15, 2,175 is not even 50%, not even 25% of that. But after the formation of Telangana in 2014, NALSA was delivered, NALSA judgment was delivered in April 2014. Telangana was formed in May, June 2014, 1.5 months later. We had a comprehensive integrated Telangana household survey, Telangana Comprehensive Integrated Household Survey, which was like a mini census within the state. And the government, when it submitted in the affidavit that they covered 2,175, we asked, and the CJ asked as well, but this is the numerator. What about the denominator? When you say you've covered so many people, out of how many have you covered so many people is the more important question. So what's the denominator? And they gave a sworn affidavit and we had RTI responses that were filed in 2014, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. And we filed our RTI responses, the government gave sworn affidavits, and take a wild guess what the overall population of transgender persons in Telangana was. And this is 6-year-old data. The 6-year-old data is 60,000 transgender persons. So 2,175 transgender persons is not 10%. 60,000, 10% is 6,000, 5% is 3,000. 2,175 is 3.6%. So 96.4% of transgender persons haven't even been covered by the public distribution system. So it is important, particularly in times of pandemic where people's mobility is majorly affected. There's no public transport. There's no subsidized public transport. There are no metros. There are no buses. Transgender persons and communities are largely disenfranchised, marginalized, and vulnerable. It is important to litigate it, particularly now, even more than before, because people are dying. People are dying of COVID. We only spoke of food security. What about Medicare and healthcare? You know how the public health system is almost crumbled now. I wouldn't say crumbling, but it has crumbled. We saw that happening in Italy, and they nationalized their private Medicare, but we haven't done anything like that in India. So people are being turned away from hospitals despite having all the symptoms of COVID. People are testing negative on antigen and RT-PCR tests, but dying of pneumonia. You know what? There are enough and more cases being reported, not necessarily of just transgender persons, but in the so-called quote-unquote mainstream society. So here we have transgender persons predominantly dependent on sex work, predominantly immunocompromised with HIV, and with immunocompromised and immunodeficient. And this could be a time bomb ticking away. If even a small community like transgender persons, imagine out of 60,000 in transgender persons, mind you, this is 6-year-old data, even if half of them were to get infected, it would be a time bomb ticking away. Right? So it's just not about food security, it's about healthcare, Medicare, housing and all that. Right now, we don't even have the bandwidth to think about it. Earlier, we felt that communes and spaces that use space very frugally. That's apartment complexes are so smart because you go vertically upwards and you give more homes to more people. But we also realize how what a multi-edged sword that is, because people use common staircases, common elevators, and in slums, in chawls, in ghettos, like what's that place in Bombay, Dharavi,
Mhm.
where sanitation, it's all public sanitation in the sense that one toilet is used by 10 or 20 or 50 families. And such pandemics just don't spread, but they rage like wild forest fires. So I don't think it's just an issue of discrimination or exclusion. It is discrimination and exclusion, but there are structural monstrosities, structural forms of structural violence that keep people out. Systems engineered to exclude and not to include.
Wow. I almost felt speechless. The idea that this huge problem is not just persistent, it is actually, as you mentioned, it's a ticking time bomb, and only somehow reinforces the idea that we are not doing enough, not enough is being talked about, not enough is being discussed. Before I could even think of asking you anything else, I have that said petition in front of me, and I see all those reliefs that you have sought with respect to trans communities. You mentioned the food security, you mentioned the medical security, if I must say. For example, you mentioned here the HIV medications, and you've also mentioned here that the LPG cylinders, something as basic and as necessary for household, not being provided. And as you have mentioned, COVID-19 has somehow dismantled this entire social construct that we have had, and one of the worst hit communities is transgender communities. I just have one follow-up question. With where all of this happens, and you see, as you mentioned, that there is a little to no response or less response from institutions, what role can individuals like myself, as a cis male, if I may like identify myself, uh, owing to the caveat that I still am not quite sure of all these gender ideologies and the conversations that still need to happen, a lot for me to learn. But for a cis male person who is perhaps the most privileged person in this Indian society, how can certain set persons make an effort to somehow contribute and somehow make situations better for transgender person communities?
Uh, hmm, that's a good question. Little drops do make an ocean. Yeah.
Mhm.
At the same time, while I say that, we cannot boil the Atlantic or the Pacific Ocean with a kerosene stove. So
Right.
within your circle of influence and circle of concern and circle of influence,
Mhm.
if people like you, you may not be a CEO, you may not be the prime minister, you may not be a chief minister, but if you can, this year is going to be extremely difficult for transgender persons, for persons with disabilities, for acid attack survivors, for women of repressed caste backgrounds like the manual scavenging, Dalit communities, bonded labor communities, migrant laborers. It is a very difficult year, the whole of this year and perhaps the next year too.
Mhm.
So I think if people can, they should temporarily adopt uh, a few such persons
Mhm.
in terms of their. I'm not saying I'm not saying. I mean, if you can, you could do that, but I wouldn't mandate anything. But
Mhm.
if people like you can every month for the whole of this year supply rations to say minimum double digit figure is 10 persons. So
Mhm.
that those 10 persons again look at people who are multiply marginalized, because you see, I am not as marginalized. I have some education, I speak English the way I do, so
Mhm.
I'm not the average transgender person. Look at somebody who's the average transgender person who's struggling, dependent on either begging or sex work, who could be Dalit, who could be from a manual scavenging or a bonded labor background. So there is disenfranchisement, vulnerability of caste, class, gender. What if that person is a transgender person who's Dalit with disability? I have such friends too. The government disability hostels are full of Dalit friends, Dalit Indians, and some of them could be transgender or queer. So look at such multiple marginalizations and multiple intersectional vulnerabilities. See if you can adopt them for 6 months or 12 months. And as you do that, see if what aligns with their aspirations, because it's not fair to tell somebody who has no aspiration. Say you wanted to become, for instance, you may have wanted to become a lawyer, but to insist on and to coerce you to becoming a doctor or a nurse or an engineer is not fair to you and to the education. Mm-hmm. So to figure out what their aspirations are, and then see if we can equip them with skills in those aspirations that are sustainable. Baba Sahib Ambedkar firmly believed, the architect of our constitution firmly believed, that there is no empowerment without ownership of resources. So personally, what I have told myself, see, I'm not Dalit, nor am I Savarna. So I'm not a super privileged caste, but I'm an OBC caste. So I haven't faced tremendous or humongous caste discrimination, but I've faced mild forms of it. So what I have told myself is that if I can enable, I won't even want to use the word enable because we're equal stakeholders. Mm-hmm. If I can work hand in hand with my transgender friends who are multiply marginalized, intersectionally vulnerable, who are Dalit, who are persons with disabilities, HIV positive persons, and get them to, there are some who are from the village background, who've done farming as landless laborers. So if I can get them trained as organic farmers and get them certified by the state and the central government, get them certified by 2 or 3 people, and reverse engineer it backwards, wherein if people are now certified to be organic farmers, because you see the futures, much of the futures in organic farming, if we want to live cancer-free, live free of liver, kidney diseases and so on, because it's back to basics, back to our ancestors, pesticide-free, plastic-free farming, So if they can get certified, where will they grow this produce? They can't grow it in their flats or in their tenements, right? They will need land. So we will need to reverse engineer that way. Look at these studios that our film world has. They didn't purchase those acres and acres of that land. That land was taken by them on some paltry pittance of some 10 rupees an acre kind of a lease 60 years ago or 70 years ago. And now they have become owners. So I don't think people privileged like me should subvert the system to become owners of vast stretches of land. Instead, we should help those at the end of the queue not to remain as laborers or as slaves, but to become owners of their own land, where they cultivate and where there are microeconomies that they nurture. You see, the pandemic and the lockdown decimated my trust in the supply chain. I don't trust these supermarkets. You may feel free to disagree, but somewhere I've simplified and decluttered my own understanding of life. If a person can cultivate his, her, or their 10 or 20 different kinds of vegetables growing right in front of their eyes, being cultivated by them, 10 different kinds of fruits, and say 10 different kinds of leafy vegetables and spices, what more does that a person want? And I don't think we need air conditioning. Is not a need. It's not even a comfort. It's a monstrous luxury that vitiates the environment, makes a hole in the ozone layer. So if we can go back to basics and live in an eco-friendly way, where we don't use plastic, we do not use air conditioners, and we coexist with the environment, I don't think viruses would be our enemies. I think the average Indian farmer who tills the soil, sows the seed, plows and harvests is symbiotically existing and coexisting with a plethora of microbes and bacteria and viruses, and symbiotically existing. I don't think we need to make such a monster out of COVID-19. And we should just learn to build our immunities to live and let live and live harmoniously. So on that note, I can't advise you or anybody, but the way I've seen it is that I want to empower people, not just into getting jobs and becoming slaves in sweatshops and shop floors of sweatshops, but also make them become owners of their own land and resources, make them become entrepreneurs or social entrepreneurs, which you see, all human rights are interconnected. If LGBT rights are human rights, if the rights of women are human rights, annihilation of caste and Dalit rights are human rights, Black rights are human rights, rights of persons with disabilities are human rights. So the way I've envisioned it for myself is to take up one step at a time, take up a mini project. I can't boil the Atlantic Ocean with a kerosene stove. I will just look at a minimum double-digit figure of 10 people, equip them, train them, get them certified, and for a lack of a better analogy, I don't like to use religion, but for a lack of a better analogy, Savitri, who was supposed to be a person in Hindu mythology whose husband was dead, and she wanted her husband's life back. And he says, the god of death says, no, you can't have his life back, but you can ask for anything else. So she very smartly and ethically says, then in which case, let me ethically become a mother. And he says, okay, fine, become a mother. And then, she reverse engineers it. And she says, but then how would I become a mother ethically without my husband? So she gets her husband's life back. So you see, people, if they get trained and certified, where will they grow their agriculture? They can't grow it in a room. They will need an acre or two of land. And that's how we could train, skill, certify people and equip them to write representations, file RTIs, chase the governments till they get land and become social entrepreneurs.
Perfect. I think there's a lot of things that we need to unpack there. I think as a society, as students specifically, or as aspirants who are already working with the industry, which is the major chunk of my viewership, is that we need to understand that these issues still plague the society and these issues very much do exist. There is a lot that has been spoken, there is a lot that has come out of this conversation that requires a lot of thinking. I personally need to go back to this conversation. I need to start forming my own opinion with a little more informed knowledge, a little more deep reading, and I need to go in depth with respect to my perspectives and my understanding, perhaps the principle behind the One Take Show, why I go about interviewing the luminaries in the field who have actually tried creating a change and sort of can add value to the perspectives of all the students who tune into this podcast. Thank you so much for this absolutely amazing conversation. Do you have any closing remarks for our listeners?
Firstly, I'm so not a luminary. While many of your earlier speakers were definitely luminaries, I forgot his name. Was he Dushyant Dave? No, but it wasn't Dushyant Dave. What was the name of that lawyer whose podcast went on air? He's a very well-renowned
Mr.
lawyer.
Sanjay Hegde?
Sanjay Hegde. So people like those, like Dushyant Dave and Sanjay Hegde and say Menka Goswami or Karuna Nandi, Jena Kothari. Who's the lawyer who represented India in the International Court of Justice? I forgot his name.
Hari Salve.
These are luminaries. I'm just a teeny weeny RTI 10 rupees wali RTI activist who all my activism is around 10 rupees. So I'm so not a luminary. Thank you for imagining me to be one, but I'm sorry to burst your bubble that I'm not.
But I think I would very strongly disagree with you at that point. The fact that there is a scope for change and you're actually doing it, there's a difference. Like you are, if paid by an RTI worth rupees set amount, I still am not the person who's filing those RTIs. You are the person who's filing those RTIs. And there is a huge chunk of society that perhaps it starts taking action. Maybe at that front, we can start somehow diluting this definition of who a luminary is. But for the purposes of this podcast, you most certainly are. And the kind of conversation that you provided us is absolutely wonderful. I had a wonderful time talking to you. I hope you had a good time too.
Thank you. I did. Thank you ever so much for the opportunity. All the best to you. I hope you become a very illustrious, ethical lawyer of unimpeachable integrity and set very high standards and take ethics and integrity to a very new, higher orbit. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would definitely love to live up to those expectations and work even harder. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.